So in a past video, I mentioned there was a logical inconsistency with regards to vegans who promote a pro-natalist agenda. In this video, I want to focus on another problematic type of vegans. This is inspired by the recent events involving roaming millennial and vegan gains who just had a debate. Of course, as a vegan myself, I have no intention to generalize vegans like roaming millennial did. My gripe is certainly not with most vegans, at least not in my experience. But it's still a significant enough number of vegans, especially here on YouTube. Starting right off, the first category of vegans I'd pick a bone with are those that are overly concerned with ideological purity. These are the deontological vegans. The second type are the domineering ones, who basically live in order to, quotes, win the argument. For them, you can see that it's as if vegan activism was an online video game where you have a scoreboard and you want to climb the ranks in a ladder system where you end up with the most kills or the most defeated opponents. So the real problem with vegans are those DD vegans, deontological vegans, and domineering vegans. Let's start with the deontological vegans. The general outline of deontological veganism is that all animal products and their byproducts are off the plate, full stop. There's no nuance. Real veganism is black and white. Whether there is harm involved in the practice or not, it doesn't matter. If you needed to exploit an animal, it's wrong. It shouldn't be done. In contrast, you have consequentialist vegans. Their position is that animal suffering is the real enemy. Whatever practices reduce animal suffering the most should be encouraged. For instance, a better impact is achieved if you could have a large number of people slightly reduce their animal product intake, then converting one person to veganism. So if you had the choice between actualizing either scenarios, you'd pick the former. To hell with purity, results are all that matter. Can you see how the first position can get in trouble pretty easily? I remember one blogger mentioning that oysters were the death of veganism. Well, he was kind of right if he meant deontological veganism. Say someone decided to stop eating all animal products except oysters. Now, maybe they want to get oysters to get preformed omega-3s, or maybe they are allergic to beans or something like that, and they want to use oysters because of their high zinc content. Whatever the case may be, it gives them peace of mind, and their diet is otherwise plant exclusive. Now, oysters are not sentient creatures, but they're still animals. So deontological vegans would say that they need to be off your plate. No compromise. Consequentialist vegans would be very happy about the result. On the other hand, understanding that it's in line with the ethics of veganism to eat something that doesn't have a central nervous system, and as far as we know, cannot feel pain. Clearly, in such an instance, there is one approach that is more sensible than the other. Now, this other type can be separate, but in my experience, it's mostly consisting of deontological vegans, and they are the domineering type. With the domineering vegan, you can sense that their primary purpose is to win the argument. It's not to encourage taking steps towards a mutual goal. The domineering vegan doesn't want to help guide a person to think about the impact of their diet and to progress at their own rhythm. What they want is to defeat their opponents with logical arguments, and that's it. These vegans essentially approach it as a battle. Veganism is a battle. You're going to war against someone. And the end goal is to create a vegan. It's not to encourage the reduction of the consumption of animal products. So if someone became plant-based, for instance, actually the term is usually shunned because it's too wishy-washy, then that person is technically still your enemy. Anyway, this attitude goes like this. You're either vegan, will become vegan after talking with me for a while once I give you the facts, which are the only thing that you need, or you're the enemy. Now, this type of approach creates a lot of conflict, and it puts a lot of unnecessary pressure on people. One way in which it's counterproductive is that it can lead a new adherent to decision fatigue, and also what some blogger termed failing with abandon. This is the idea that If you have failed in some way towards your goal, you might as well fail the whole way. So if diet improvements were the goal, oftentimes instead of viewing a failure as a slip-up and going back to working towards your previous goal, you let yourself be dragged down to the point where there's just too much momentum against you and you give up entirely. This happens more often to people who go all in immediately. When you make a drastic diet change, you actually have much less chances of long-term success than those who take the time they need to transition. It sucks for vegans to admit this, but it's true. In the worst cases, I've noticed that this all-or-nothing attitude lends itself to negatively impacting the lives of people who have eating disorders. And it often serves to hide them in a way that appears healthy to the person. But most importantly of all, and I can't overstress this, there is a necessity for vegans to realize that their competitive nature and domineering attitudes need to be seen as personality flaws, not something to brandish and praise in each other. If you go on virtually any of Vegan Gain's videos, you will see exactly what I mean. Most of the top comments you see there are things like, "Oh, you really destroyed that person. Oh, that was such rape. I feel bad for her." I think it's no coincidence that Richard is an online gamer. This is the kind of pervading attitude that you see in the online competitive gaming community. Really, the only respect and kindness that you see there is usually between professionals who have a contract with organizations, and they would hurt their brand and sponsors if they behaved in such a way. This type of behavior is just completely wrong-minded when it comes to advocating for veganism. And no, I'm not going to make the argument that it's wrong-minded because you might offend people or hurt their feelings and they need to hear the truth. I see a lot of people using this anti-SJW sentiment as an excuse to just be shitty advocates for veganism. My argument is that it's inconsistent because that domineering attitude, the motive behind it, is actually the same motive that leads people to uncritically exploit animals and kill them for food. You don't realize it, but that's what you're engaging in when you shit on someone's intellect in a public space and establish yourself as the dominant one. It's the idea that just because you have the power to, you should. That's wrong-minded. You might have the power to make an uneducated non-vegan or even an anti-vegan look foolish because you know your stuff, but that doesn't mean you should seek to, quotes, destroy them and insult them for not being knowledgeable. That really only serves you, and to revel in that power betrays your supposed selfless motives as a vegan. As soon as you do this, what you're really doing is not attempting to reduce animal suffering. That's clear. What you're doing is you're attempting to climb a dominance hierarchy. See, the logical discourse that we employ when we get into arguments, those things that we say, they're not the whole story. It's more accurate to view logical discourse as a kind of facade that exists to suit the needs of our unconscious primitive drives. Freud called these the id impulses. Schopenhauer called this the will, and he established and went to prove in his philosophy that it has precedence over reason. He figured this out before the biologists did their experiments, and before the psychologists even established the existence of an unconscious mind. It isn't enough to be a vegan or to be anything else if you're not aware that you're driven by unconscious processes. Now, you might be the demeaning type and point at people you have converted to veganism and say, "See, my method actually works." But pointing to that result is in no way an argument against what I'm saying here. It merely distracts from it. Imagine that there is a kind of depraved cult that exists where people perform things like female genital mutilation and human ritual sacrifices, but they also happen to be vegan because of their scripture. Would you be happy if those were the people converting most people to veganism? Similarly, I'm not happy about the way that you make this into an ego thing. I have no reason to believe that your converts haven't benefited overall and have benefited veganism in the long haul, which is the only thing that matters. I'm extremely skeptical that the act of indulging one's own needs for ego gratification is the best way to do anything in the long term. I would point out that you're also leaving all of those other people that you've antagonized out of the picture who could have been swayed by a different approach. Those people might never be interested in learning more about veganism simply because they associate your unpleasantness with it. The problem as it pertains to YouTube is that this platform is suited towards entertainment and drama. This is the best way to get people's attention, even for a noble cause. People have a shitty attention span. They want to unwind, they want to laugh, and they want convenient hero narratives to take part in. So it's the loud ideologues that get the most attention. People look up to these simple-minded ideologues, and they see them as heroes who, no matter what, tell the truth without worrying about people's feelings. In recent years, this has come to be associated with a general attitude that's anti-SJW, quotes facts over feelings. Well, you want facts. Here's a fact. Egocentrism is not the virtue you're preaching when you're preaching veganism. It doesn't suddenly become a good thing in your treatment of others. There is a better way to conduct yourself, and there is a way to tell the truth in a manner that's more kind and productive. More importantly for you, a way that doesn't betray what you stand for. I think we should forgive people for getting upset in a heated debate, but to base your entire internet presence around this need to dominate others is at best a childish indulgence and at worst incredibly harmful. I would argue that it's not the quantity of people that you turn vegan that matters, especially in the short term. It's the quality of the people in the long term. Now, you might make the argument that the animals just don't care. As long as you're a vegan, that's all that matters. And I'd say that it's precisely for the animals that we should care about the way that we behave. There are so many variables to account for, and the future is uncertain, so don't think that you know what's going to be best in the future with your isolated data point. What I think is fair to say is that what leads to cooperation is a better understanding of ourselves. And we need cooperation way more than we need competition. Here's another fact. When you proudly go to battle, armed with your logical arguments, and you establish yourself as someone's adversary, you trigger what's called the backfire effect. What that means is that your arguments, your facts, they are weapons against you. They're not working for you. By competitively arguing with each other, both parties become even stronger believers in their own positions. I suspect that this happens because both can sense that the other is trying to assert his dominance through the use of logical discourse, and neither want to submit to the other. You might argue that even though the person has not conceded, they have not submitted to you, at least you've planted a seed of doubt in the other person's mind with your facts. To this I would say, yeah, but you're naive if you think that it was the best way for that seed to grow. You could have done the exact same thing without being domineering. The sad thing is, Vegan Gains seems to be aware of this problem, yet is unable to change due to his own psychological issues.
My outlook has really changed since I took shrooms. Like, it gave me a different level of empathy. Like, before, I had like a really crazy out-of-body experience in a hospital when I was like severely ill. It just made me realize that selfishness is sort of it's sort of the death of all things. Like, in order for life to advance, you need to have empathy and put a value on other people's lives. So even though I had a very difficult time empathizing with people, I'd behave in a way that was empathetic. Yeah. And since I took shrooms, it's changed a bit. Like, I actually have empathy with people now. I still have some weird sociopathic tendencies. Like, I still am sadistic. Like, I actually enjoy hurting people and shit, but...
Vegan Gains is completely right here. Personally, I would define egoism and egocentrism differently. Egoism is not necessarily harmful, and it's kind of inescapable. But egocentrism is the death of everything. With egoism, there is space for cooperation between two self-interested individuals, but with egocentrism, there's no space for cooperation because people are driven by this need for dominance. From the Neolithic period until now, that's what we've been doing. We've been primarily using our brains for this purpose. All that has changed are the means by which we exert our dominance. The only way that humanity won't destroy itself is if that changes soon enough, but personally, I wouldn't bet on it. Now, one counter-argument I might get is from Darwinists or neo-Darwinists. They'll say that they're just acting naturally since the mechanism of evolution is a process of competition through natural selection. In other words, it's the alpha thing to do, to assert your dominance. The problem with that is that it's just one interpretation of one mechanism of evolution. Many have argued that there's more to the story. It's not just will to power like Nietzsche said. It does seem to be a convenient way to justify one's narcissism, but what do these people have to say about the theories put forth by those who brought up the topic of symbiosis and cooperation, notably one that Lynn Margulis introduced discussing mitochondria? These mitochondria resulted from a symbiosis between pre-existing forms called the anaerobiotics, which could live in the absence of oxygen, and the new forms, which during photosynthesis managed to adapt in a way that used oxygen to make ATP, all the while getting rid of it because they gave oxygen the 2 electrons that it was missing, and once achieved made of it a molecule like any other instead of a free radical that's dangerous for all living structures. For this symbiosis to occur, there's no competition, only cooperation. And which stage of evolution was more important than this one? Look at the history of human life on Earth, what we've done on this planet, the constant ideological battles taking place. We don't need more of that. We're scared animals. We have very little understanding of what drives us. What we need is a better understanding. Otherwise, all we do is merely repeat history. I want to conclude this video with something that I read recently and found deeply interesting. I believe I can tie it into this because I think one other problem with vegans is wanting results too quickly. I understand the pressing desire to end animal suffering, but the problem vegans are not aware of is that not only are rapid transformations of values unlikely, they're also likely undesirable. In an interview, the multidisciplinary researcher and physician Henri Laborie discusses how it can actually lead to illness in a population. This is just my quick and rough translation from the French. Laborie says, I was supposed to do a paper for the World Psychiatric Association. I was to study mental illnesses in the South Pacific, linked to urbanization, industrialization, and tourism. They had noticed that people who were free of mental illnesses for centuries suddenly began having a lot of problems when their values, which had a specific place in their nervous systems, were completely transformed and replaced by others. When I first traveled to the islands, I met with the director of the hospital of one of the American Samoa Islands, and I asked him which illnesses they were treating there. He said, there are no mental illnesses here, people are doing well. I said, really? He replied, to be frank, I will finally have to open a psychiatric ward, because some illnesses have just begun appearing. This island, which has only 29,000 inhabitants, is a true paradise, but some people are no longer happy. I asked him how he explained this newfound depression in those inhabitants. The doctor said, this island has been occupied by the Americans during the war against the Japanese, for the simple and unique reason that there was an enormous and deep harbor with summits of 2,000 meters of altitude that went steep into the ocean. It was surrounded with a ring of coral reefs with a narrow passage to enter the harbor, a passage that you could mine. The Americans protected the essential elements of their fleet in that harbor. We won the war, and having somewhat used the population of the island, we estimated would be doing a, quotes, good deed, when in fact, the real goal was of course to develop commerce here. We built the Hilton and the Sheraton hotels with magnificent gardens. Since then, billionaires come with their yachts and their women, and they sunbathe. Daily, there are planes dropping off old men. Tours are organized. To help these tourists visit the island, a quadruple track road was built. The old men do tours of the island by bus. At night, they are brought back to their hotels and assist to a folklore seance with tam-tams and women. A folklore not of the Samoans, who are not interested in it, but the inhabitants of Fiji. The tourists don't know how to distinguish between the folklore of the Fijians and the one of the Samoans, so they leave contented, convinced of their knowing Samoa culture, and ready to share the memories of their trips. What could Americans bring to the population? A hospital. A beautiful hospital with excellent workers. Also, education, since the population is illiterate. Teaching them how to read and write was no easy job. Nonetheless, a few of them managed to achieve a high level of scientific knowledge. So we opened a, quote, high school, unquote. Every year we form about 15 to 20 engineers, computer scientists, etc. As you can imagine, we can't give these highly qualified workers any jobs on the island. So we give them a nice diploma and they leave for the United States. The Samoans, are Melanesians. They're very dark-skinned and big-lipped. When they arrive in the US with their diplomas, they're not preferred in times of recession. They don't find work. What they find instead is alcohol. These men now discover alcohol and drugs, mostly hard drugs. After about 6 months, they've had enough. They're broke. They're just vegetating, feeling useless. So they want to leave, and they come back. You can imagine that these people won't easily mix in with the natives now. They have attained a certain degree of sociology. They have a class, which no longer allows them to mix in with the illiterate. And it's important to mention that the 3,000 or 4,000 Americans there make no effort to meet with these people. So these men are completely isolated, without jobs, rejected by their own brothers and by the Americans. They fall into delinquency and mental illness. And me? I have to open a psychiatric ward to treat our students. Understanding this situation, concluded the director of the hospital, was a true shock of values and of civilizations. People will tell me that Americans have done this so as to help the Samoans. But they didn't need help. They were fine. We only taught them to know something else. So this was obviously a drastic change in the population's values. It's hard to imagine something this drastic would happen simply because you'd remove carnism from society. Still though, I thought I would include it because it gives a sense of the massive unforeseen repercussions that may happen from something that may seem trivial or even positive, like becoming educated. With all of this said, I think that the process of change is a slow-moving one, and it both gives and takes. It's impossible to predict how things will turn out. But impatience and aggression, when promoting any ideology, are very unlikely to yield the desired consequences.